It's morning time for me. Sun is out, feeling good. Welcome to class. Welcome to your mini lesson on anti-oppression and anti-racism through the scope of yoga philosophy. My name is Morgan, and I'll be holding space for our mini lesson today. So I have been talking in the past months about anti-oppression through the scope of something called the Kleshas. The Kleshas are a specific piece of yoga philosophy that are known as the afflictions of the mind, also known as the veils of the mind. So I like to look at the Kleshas as almost, translucent veils over the eyes that are obscuring the clarity of consciousness or obscuring the clarity of truth. The reason that we are not, all of us, walking around experiencing pure consciousness every day is because of the kleshas, which are things that are naturally occurring in the human mind. They're kind of part of the contract of being here and being embodied as a human person. They're very natural, they're nothing to be ashamed of, but they are something to study and learn about the mind. There are 5 kleshas, and today we're talking about the 4th one, which is known as DVESHA, DVESHA, also aversion. DVESHA also calls on a few other topics of yoga philosophy that I'll touch on. DVESHA, as far as aversion, very simply put, is a patterned negative perspective on something based on one experience. That one experience we can call the samskara. So to explain the samskara, I want you to visualize a plain or a desert of very smooth sand, like no footprints, no ridges, shadows, nothing, completely flat for all intents and purposes. Imagine taking a rake and drawing a deep line in the sand. So that line is the samskara. The sand, the desert, is the field of the mind, the field of consciousness. So in the field of consciousness, that one single line, the samskara, is the experience of aversion to one thing. So I'll use a personal example for myself. I used to really love whitewater river rafting. I used to love it. I thought it was an amazing way to engage with water and earth, and it's very big here in Colorado, where I live, where I'm from. And I had one super dangerous experience a few years ago where I was with some advanced raft guides who were much more comfortable in the water than I was. And we went over a waterfall that was like 10 or 11 feet long, and the raft completely flipped over. I lost my helmet. I couldn't figure out which way was up. I was underwater for a while. I was really terrified. I floated downriver, got yanked out of the water by the raft guide, and was just shaken. I was just shaken and scared, and I didn't like it, and I haven't rafted since because of it, because that is my one aversion to it. I had one bad experience that cut me off from experiencing the joy and freedom that was associated with just an objective activity. Do you see what I'm saying? So that one terrible experience of the raft flipping over and capsizing and me just losing my way in the water for a couple of minutes is that very deep samskara in my mind, that very deep line, which is ultimately the DVESHA, the aversion that I hold for river rafting. Now, I haven't gone rafting since then because of it. So DVESHA is interesting because it's really rooted in the emotions. It's really rooted in the emotional part of the human spirit. It's usually related to one negative experience, and then DVESHA is we say no forever because we're afraid of it hurting again. Does that make sense? I want to clear this up because people get this kind of mixed up with saying no to things and having judgment. You are still allowed to have judgment. You're still allowed to say no to experiences. Even people who are well along the path of deep spiritual veneration and Buddhism exercise keen judgment against certain things that are wrong or go against, their moral code. You're allowed to express judgment and say no to things like, this feels wrong, this feels unhealthy, this feels abusive, this feels not quite right in my body. And that's okay. You're allowed to have that. You're allowed to have judgment. DVESHA, on the other hand, is very important to recognize. Am I saying no because I feel this is like very wrong or very incorrect for my life moral code? Or am I saying wrong because I have an or saying no because I have an aversion to this experience, and that's just my opinion now, right? It's very interesting to talk about the samskara as well, that line, because every time we give that DVESHA affirmation, every time we say no and we say because of that experience, every time I opt out of rafting because of that one capsized moment I have, that DVESHA, that samskara gets deeper and deeper and deeper. This is amazing because we see this in the brain as well in regard to neural communication. So every time we have a single thought, that's a bridge built between two neurons in the brain. The more that we enforce that thought pattern, that neuron gets stronger. So what once used to be just a tiny little walkway in the mind or a tiny line in the sand is now a massive super highway in the brain that's reinforced. The samskara in the sand is now not a line anymore, it's now a trench. So giving into aversion over and over again is almost reinforcing a negative behavior or a negative way of thinking. And by negative, I mean DVESHA, unless you are super, super conscious of it, is you saying no to the possibility of learning something new. DVESHA is you saying no to the possibility of experiencing radical joy, radical healing, radical perspective in your life. The way I'd like to relate DVESHA back to anti-oppression is namely in the context of being in uncomfortable conversations around anti-racism, white supremacy, and racial justice. I don't know about you, but I'm in a lot of those conversations. I'm having a lot of those conversations with my family members who do not share my worldview. Many of my family members who are a lot older than me, generations older, who grew up in a very different world, do not share my worldview. So leaning into these conversations about talking about anti-racism, racial justice, who you voted for. My grandparents voted for Donald Trump, so these are conversations that feel entirely pertinent for me to be having with my blood relatives. They're not comfortable. They take a lot of emotional and psychological energy to have, and a lot of convincing. And it is very easy to opt out of having and holding these conversations with your people, with your community, because the mind wants to protect itself. The ego wants to protect itself. Your ego wants to protect itself. Their ego wants to protect itself. And ego self-protection looks like being right and being the rightest person in the room. And if we are coming together as a species, talking about these forces in our society that are insidious and just under the surface, we really need to table the desire to be right. We need to table the desire to be the rightest person in the room, for our worldview to become everyone's worldview. And this is for both parties. This is if you're having these deep conversations with your family members on how real white supremacy is. This is for you if you are on the receiving end of those conversations and you feel like your worldview is being threatened. DVESHA, and I think listening and coming together on a common ground with anti-racism is listening for the sake of understanding, not listening to have a response or to be right. So if you are having these difficult conversations with your family members and it gets difficult, it might get to the point where you're like, this is not worth my time or energy anymore, and you retire your efforts to go be with your community, people who reinforce your worldview. I'm gonna give you some tough love as your friend and your supporter. You can't stop holding space for these conversations. You can't opt out, you can't tap out. While it's deeply necessary and healing to go be with your community who shares your worldview, to reinforce you, to fill your cup back up, to remind you why we are fighting, why we are talking about these things, you need that, but you also need to get back in the ring. And not for the sake of combat, but for the sake of doing the work. This is everybody's work. This is everybody's work, making this time to understand, to converse. And so if your DVESHA, your aversion is like, this is too much for me, I need to opt out, recognize that. Recognize that response and try to discern it. If it is your ego saying, I am tired of being wrong, I'm just going to opt out, or if you're having a real judgment against, something. Oftentimes, DVESHA is kind of the cop-out. It's us saying, I'm tired, or I'm scared, or I don't want that to happen again. I encourage you to get back into it and hold those conversations. If you are on the receiving end of these conversations, if someone near and dear to you or in your community is essentially threatening your worldview by talking about white supremacy and anti-racism, your DVESHA might be telling you to not listen. Your DVESHA might be telling you to run away, to preserve your worldview, right? Stay open to being wrong. Everybody. Stay open to being wrong. Stay open to being uncomfortable. Stay open to learning new ways how to communicate. I see this every day, people with different perspectives shutting each other down, shutting down communication, breaking down, becoming each other's enemy in this conversation. And I think we need to be more open. I think we need to be setting the DVESHA aside in certain circumstances and having these difficult conversations regardless. That experience is obviously going to be different for everybody. As a white presenting Indigenous woman of color, I feel that I have more responsibility to hold these conversations and educate than, for example, our Black siblings, our Black sisters and brothers who may be way too fucking exhausted to be doing it anymore. Do you see what I mean? So there is a spectrum here, and I encourage you to find your place on that spectrum and find that area of stretch for having these conversations. I'm not saying get out there and overextend yourself and try to change everybody's mind, but I am saying have a voice in this movement. Have a backbone in this movement. I hope that makes sense. I get a little passionate, which I think is needed. And DVESHA is tricky. DVESHA pops up everywhere. You're not just an anti-oppression, but notice and start to recognize how it takes shape in your life. If you have just an aversion to like things for no really good reason, you know, like a certain smell or a certain color or a certain TV show or even a certain just like subtleties of things around you, start to just get curious. It doesn't mean that you're wrong, doesn't mean you have to police the way that you have preferences in your life, but be curious. Yoga philosophy wants you to be curious about yourself, about your mind and your tendencies, because yoga philosophy ultimately wants you to reach samadhi, or pure consciousness. And this is one of the easy ways to do it. So I hope this makes sense to you. I hope DVESHA is something that feels a little bit more cleared up for you in your life and in your relationship to your anti-oppression practice. It has been my deep honor to hold this space for you and your learning, and always reach out if you have any questions on clarification. I love you. Thank you for being here. Have such a gorgeous rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Thank you.